The doll. It was a cold and rainy autumn night when Sophie discovered a dusty box in the attic of her grandmother's old house. The house was old and it creaked with every gust of wind. Her grandmother had passed away a few weeks ago, and Sophie was here to go through some keepsakes before the house was sold. She had always felt uneasy in this old building, but tonight was different. It was as if the walls were whispering something. The box in the attic was covered in cobwebs, and the wooden lid seemed to have been unopened for decades. Curious, she bent down to open it. As she lifted the lid, a cold breeze hit her face, even though the room was sealed. Inside lay an old doll, so old that its eyes had turned dull and cloudy, and the porcelain it was made of had slight cracks. It wore an old-fashioned dress, and its hair looked like real human hair. This made Sophie feel uneasy. At the bottom of the box was a small note. "Never leave her alone," it said in old, flowing handwriting. Sophie laughed nervously and carefully took the doll out. She had never liked dolls, but something about this one fascinated her. Perhaps it was the craftsmanship, or maybe it was the strange aura that surrounded it. "You'll keep me company while I finish up," Sophie said without knowing why. She placed the doll on the table next to her while she continued to rummage through her grandmother's old belongings. Time passed, and soon Sophie began to feel uncomfortable, as if she was being watched. She kept glancing over at the doll. It sat motionless on the table, but it felt as though its dull eyes were following her every move. Night fell, and the rain lashed against the windows. Sophie felt like she should leave the house, but she wanted to finish going through the last few boxes. She went downstairs to the kitchen to make herself some tea, leaving the doll behind in the attic. As she held the steaming cup in her hand, she suddenly heard a faint noise. It sounded like something was scratching in the attic. Probably just the wind, she told herself, even though she knew the windows were closed. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She set her cup down and cautiously went back up the creaking stairs. When she entered the attic, her breath caught in her throat. The doll was no longer on the table. "Maybe I knocked it over," she whispered to herself, though she knew that wasn't the case. Nervously, she searched the floor for the doll. There, in the corner of the room, she saw it, sitting, facing the wall. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Sophie slowly approached the doll, picked it up, and placed it back on the table. She felt as though invisible eyes were watching her every move. Suddenly, there was a clattering behind her. She turned around and saw that an old chest had fallen from the shelf. Her heart pounded in her chest. She picked up the chest and opened it. Inside was an old diary belonging to her grandmother. The pages were yellowed and written in fading ink. It didn't take long before Sophie discovered something disturbing. Her grandmother had written about the doll. "This thing is cursed," it read. "My mother gave it to me, but since then something has changed in the house. It's as if it's watching me. Sometimes it moves when I look away. I've had nightmares about it. In one dream, it spoke to me and said it would never leave. I've tried to get rid of it, but it always comes back." Sophie could hardly believe what she was reading. She stared at the doll, which now sat eerily still on the table. Suddenly, she heard a giggle. It was a soft, hollow giggle that didn't seem to come from a person. Her throat tightened as she turned around. No one was there, only the doll. Panicking, Sophie grabbed the doll and ran down the stairs. She had to get rid of it. She ran through the rain, across the garden to the well at the edge of the property. Without thinking, she threw the doll into the well and watched it sink into the water. A wave of relief washed over her. As Sophie went back into the house, it was deathly quiet. She closed the door and leaned heavily against it, hoping that she had put the matter to rest. But as she turned around, her heart stopped. Sitting on the kitchen table was the doll, soaking wet with the same blank expression in its eyes. "How?" Sophie put her hands over her face, her breath quickening. She couldn't understand it. She had just thrown it away. Yet there it sat as if nothing had happened. The doll giggled again, this time louder. "You can't get rid of me," a voice whispered so quietly Sophie thought she imagined it. But it was the doll. Its lips had moved. In a panic, Sophie grabbed the lighter from the shelf. "If I burn you, you'll be gone forever," she screamed. But the moment she lit the flame, the power in the house went out. She was plunged into darkness, with only the flicker of the lighter illuminating the room. "No, that was a mistake," the voice whispered in her head. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. cold, heavy footsteps. Slowly, she turned around, and there it was, a figure barely visible but undeniably there, holding the doll in its hand. "She's mine," the figure said before disappearing into the shadows. Sophie dropped the lighter and stumbled backward, but it was too late. The doll was gone, along with the menacing presence. Sophie stood frozen in the dark room, her heart racing. The figure had vanished, but the feeling of dread remained. She wasn't sure if she was imagining things, or if the doll and the figure were truly real. The rain continued to lash against the windows, and the house was eerily silent, broken only by Sophie's shallow breathing. She reached for the lighter on the floor, picked it up, and sparked the flame once more. The tiny glow barely illuminated her surroundings. Suddenly, she heard a dull thudding sound coming from the ceiling. It was as though someone was walking heavily above her. Her entire body froze. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself, but the noise didn't stop. The footsteps were slow and rhythmic, as if someone was shuffling across the attic above her. Sophie knew she had to go up and check, but her legs refused to move. She didn't want to go back up there, not after what had happened. Yet something inside her urged her to find her way back to the stairs. Taking a deep breath, she opened the kitchen door and cautiously stepped into the dark hallway. Each step felt heavy and hesitant. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath her as she slowly ascended. The footsteps above her grew quieter, but she knew something was waiting for her. When she reached the top step, she saw the door to the attic. It was slightly ajar, and behind it she could hear faint giggling, accompanied by a scratching noise. Sophie pushed the door open fully, and her throat tightened. The room was empty, but in the middle of the attic, lying on the dusty wooden floor, was the doll. It was no longer wet, but dry, as if nothing had happened. Yet now it seemed different, larger, more menacing. Slowly, Sophie approached the doll, its glassy eyes fixed on her. Her whole body trembled. She didn't want to touch it, but she had to know what was happening. Before she could do anything, she heard a whisper. "You cannot escape." The voice didn't come from the doll, but from the shadows that filled the room. The air felt thick and unnaturally cold. Sophie stepped back, and suddenly, from the corners of the room, dark figures emerged. They seemed to materialize out of nowhere, their faces hidden in the darkness, but their eyes glowed a deep, unsettling red. Sophie bolted toward the door, stumbling down the stairs and into the darkness of the hallway. She frantically tried to reach the front door, but as she grabbed the handle, it was locked tight. She pulled and tugged at it, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart pounded as she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like the dark figures moving toward her. Desperate, Sophie ran into the living room, knocking over furniture in the hopes of slowing them down. But as she looked around, she spotted the doll. It was sitting on her grandmother's old armchair, staring at her, its eyes gleaming in the faint light. The giggling grew louder, deafening, and Sophie collapsed to her knees. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice trembling with fear. The whisper returned. "You belong to me. You never left." Sophie felt the air around her grow colder as the darkness began to close in on her. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a like and a comment.